Hello and welcome to my video on the architecture of the evolved self. Like many people today, I'd like to build a functioning model of the human mind. I see people in the Big Blue project modeling microcolumns of neurons almost down to the molecular level, seeing if they can't somehow unlock the mystery of consciousness. I read about people playing with neural nets and trying to turn the water of von Neumann machines into the wine of machine consciousness. And I hear people still debating whether the soul survives death, whether there is a soul, how it's different than the mind or the self, what consciousness is, or if consciousness is. I also hear people who suspect that consciousness is some type of cosmic emergent property mysteriously manifested in humans by which the Brahmic universe is able to reflexively meditate upon its own cosmic belly button. And I also hear the opposing view from hardcore non-teleological evolutionists claiming that there is no supernatural cosmic reality, that humans are just simians with hyper-mutated cortexes and a somewhat hyper-significant view of their own cosmic specialness. In other words, there's a significant yawning chasm today between the realms of neurology and the realms of first-person psychology. There's a significant chasm between our understanding of what's happening on the biological and neurophysical level within the neurons of our brains and what's happening phenomenologically or experientially in our internal, immaterial, confusing first-person minds. If we're ever to build a functioning brain or mind, I believe we need to bridge this chasm. If we're ever to build an explanatory bridge across this chasm, I believe we need to first develop some type of midpoint target. We need a more general scheme that acknowledges the key architectural building blocks of our human minds, something to which the efforts of the Big Blue modelers can then triangulate. I believe their efforts will ultimately be helpful, but they need to be preceded by a higher level, more systematic description of the mind. We need a more general architecture of the self, or architecture of the human mind, before we can determine how these interesting and complex microcolumns fit into the overall puzzle. I want to present my thoughts, my theory, my proposed architecture of the evolved self. And I emphasize evolved self because my perspective, my assumption is that although consciousness may be fascinating and fraught with allusions to cosmic ontologies, I contend that we need to view it more pragmatically, i.e. in the more natural context of evolution. We should view the mind and the self as being driven by evolutionary and survival concerns. We need to constantly remind ourselves that the brain and mind emerged and evolved not to satisfy some a priori cosmic purpose, but because it apparently conferred a survival advantage upon its owners. We should deconstruct the human self while acknowledging that it was forged hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago in the competitive canopies of rainforests and the sometimes brutal savannas of Africa, and that fundamentally the basic motors and drivers that propel us through our 21st century lives today are not that different than the psychological motors and drivers that motivate even the simplest organisms. So, without further ado, let me present my thoughts, my theory, my depiction of the architecture of the evolved human mind. Taking a cue from evolution, I'm going to propose that the key motivators of our daily lives are desire modules. For the sake of discussion, we can view these as existing in two categories or tiers. Tier 1 being the more hardwired and survivally significant, Tier 2 being less so. I also want to say that I'm not contending that these modules are distinct little black boxes with clearly demarcated behavioral boundaries. I merely present them in this way to simplify the architecture, realizing that the brain is very interconnected and that the behaviors that emanate from it are more organic and overlapping. So, Tier 1 consists of the proverbial 4 F's of survival seen in virtually every animal that walks, slithers, flies, or swims on this competitive planet today. They are feed, fight, flight, and sex. These desire modules, or DMs, provide us with our basic raison d'etre. The DMs from the second tier, or the behaviors that emanate from them, more or less support those in the first tier. Here are some examples. Protect and take care of our young, take care of ourselves, help and be nice to others within our social group, maintain our social standing within the group, otherwise known as saving face with our peers, obtain the approval of our superiors, e.g. our parents when we're young, our teachers and bosses when we're older, and for some, their God, acquire objects. There are others, but this gives you a general idea. At any given time in our day, whatever we're doing, it's fundamentally because we're trying to satisfy the dictates of one or more of these desire modules. Once we do, we momentarily feel pleased, and then some other DM kicks in. From an evolutionary perspective and from a survival perspective, this is basically what we do as living beings. One could argue that in a very simple paradise-like environment with absolutely no competition, an actual thinking brain might not even be required. There would always be plenty of readily available food, no predators to run from, and no competition for sex. However, this isn't and wasn't the case, and for this reason we have brains. Which brings us to the core, the intellectual meat of the architecture, the intellectual modules. I contend that the brunt of our everyday thinking, or the activities within which the human mind typically finds itself, can be found within these three major intellectual modules. They are the top-level optimizer, the pathing module, and the likening or curiosity module. Now, I'm not going to be able to fully explain each of these modules within what remains of a 10-minute video. However, I do cover these in varying degrees in some of my other YouTube videos, as well as in my book, Evolving Towards the Truth. The top-level optimizer, or TLO, is what sadly destroys the cosmically appealing idea of free will. This is the module that is involved in choosing between the dictates of two active DMs or in choosing between two forks in the road or path. It's heavily swayed by the endorphins or the internal morphine produced by our DMs. It may seem as if we're free to choose whatever we want. However, I contend that in the end we'll employ the calculus of felicity and always choose the option that we believe will provide the greatest pleasure and the least pain in either the short or long term. The pathing module. This is where we spend our first-person time when we're trying to determine how to achieve a goal. More specifically, how to get from A to C, or A to F, or A to Z. The easiest way to think of it is geographically or spatially, as if you were a hominid in tree A trying to determine the best path to tree C. Today we use this module for short and long-term planning, like how do I get from a condition where I have no car and no girlfriend to a condition where I do have a car and a girlfriend? Or how can I please my wife and not look like a wimp to my drinking buddies? Or how can I have my cake and eat it too? In other words, what is the best, least painful solution path from here to there? The final intellectual module is the likener or the curiosity module. This is our key analysis or investigation module. We use it when we encounter some new object or situation or phenomenon. For example, imagine you're walking through the produce section of the grocery store and happen to see some new object. The little voice in the back of your mind might ask, "What is that?" But really, it's the likening module asking, what is that like? What other fruit or vegetable that I've already encountered does this new object most closely resemble? As I said, this is a very cursory explanation of these three modules, but I contend that these three functions constitute roughly 95% of what the self does, or what the self is, in our typical moment-to-moment lives. In a typical stressful situation, we're using all three of these skills. One or more of our DMs is driving us to some object, some person, or some situation. We consider the paths available to us. We try to determine which path is the least painful or least costly. We scan our memories, trying to recall if this new problem or this new objective is maybe like some previous problem we once encountered, trying to make sure there isn't possibly some third, even easier path. Once the self-system is reasonably confident that it has a plausible path, we choose, we launch, we execute, hoping for the best. So that's the basis of the architecture of the evolved self. I'd love to elaborate more on the mechanics and implementation of the likening and pathing modules, but that's all we have time for right now. Please be sure and post your comments, questions, and criticisms. I'm Jeff Kosmosky. Thanks for watching.